So hello everyone, my name is Julia Collins and I am a protocol specialist at the Clinical Coordinating Center for the NIDA CTN. I'll be presenting today on considerations for utilizing single IRBs within the NIDA CTN. So here's a brief outline of what I will cover during today's presentation. First, I will provide an overview of the NIH single IRB policy and the regulatory landscape in which we are currently implementing this policy. Then I will talk about how and when to identify a single IRB, including the available IRB options, and how to evaluate single IRB candidates. Finally, I will discuss some considerations for working with a single IRB and provide links to several useful resources. So let's start with some background. So by now, most of you are aware of the NIH single IRB policy that became effective in January 2018. This policy, which was originally published in June 2016, sets the expectation that NIH-funded multi-site studies conducting the same protocol use a single IRB to carry out the ethical review of the proposed research. The primary intention of this policy is to reduce the amount of time it takes to launch a new multi-site clinical research study, since having too many IRBs reviewing the protocol and consent documents for the same study is a major contributor to delaying study startup, often with no added benefit in terms of the protections for our human research participants. The policy came into effect on January 25, 2018. The CTN informally adopted this policy and has since formalized the requirement in version 7 of the CTN policies and procedures. To reflect the NIH single IRB policy, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is including the single IRB requirement in the upcoming final versions of the Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects, also known as the Common Rule. And implementation of this is currently scheduled for January 21st, 2019. The new Common Rule will require that most federally funded U.S.-based cooperative research projects use a single IRB, be it a commercial, academic, or hospital-based IRB, starting in January of 2020. Before we continue, I want to take a second to remind everyone that the terms single IRB and central IRB are not necessarily synonymous, despite the fact that they are often used interchangeably. So although both are designed to help streamline IRB review, the NIH defines a central IRB as the IRB of record that provides the ethical review for all sites participating in more than one multi-site study. The sites are usually in a network, consortium, or particular program. Conversely, the NIH defines a single IRB as the IRB of record selected on a study-by-study basis, which provides the ethical review for all sites participating in a multi-site study. The CTN policies and procedures uses the term single IRB, and that is the required terminology within the CTN. Now that we know the context for the single IRB requirement and the difference between a single IRB and a central IRB, I'm going to move into the process of identifying a single IRB. It is important to start considering which IRB will serve as a single IRB very early on in the protocol development process. Once the protocol concept is approved by NIDA, the lead investigative team should begin their preliminary research on the single IRB option that makes the most sense for the study. If you plan on approaching the local academic IRB associated with the lead investigator's institution, do this very early on to get a sense of whether your local IRB has the ability to serve in this capacity. Many small to mid-sized institutions, and even some larger institutions, simply do not have the infrastructure to serve as a single IRB of record for a multi-site trial. If your local IRB cannot serve as a single IRB, start exploring other options as early as possible during the protocol development phase. I'll talk a little bit more about the available options later in the presentation. The lead investigative team should have a few potential IRBs in mind by mid-protocol development and should start vetting and ranking each potential IRB a few months before it's time to submit to the DSMB. It's important that you have the majority of the protocol fleshed out by the time the single IRB is vetted, especially with regards to the inclusion of vulnerable subjects such as prisoners. The CCTN strongly recommends that CTN study teams plan to obtain a prisoner certification from the Office of Human Research Protection. But in order to obtain this OHAR prisoner certification, the IRB must provide a prisoner representative who can review the protocol on behalf of this population. With implementation of the NIH Single IRB policy, the CTN has started requiring that a Single IRB plan be included in the initial submission to the DSMB. Since the Single IRB that will be utilized in the study must be listed on the Single IRB plan, the lead investigative team must have selected their Single IRB by the time of the initial DSMB submission, which is usually due within 4 months of the date of concept approval. I'll talk a bit more about Single IRB plan requirements on the next slide. All right, so what's a Single IRB plan? This is a document that must be completed by the lead investigative team and submitted to the DSMB with the initial protocol submission. The Single IRB plan should include a policy adherence statement, the name and OHARB registration number of the IRB that will serve as the Single IRB of record, a Single IRB use statement for all participating sites, a communication plan for interactions between the Single IRB and participating sites, as well as details on how the reliance agreement records and the communication plan will be maintained. More information on how to write the Single IRB plan, including a template plan, are included within the DSMB document on the Investigator's Toolbox on the CTN website. I've provided this link for you guys at the end of this presentation. So one of the biggest hurdles to implementing the Single IRB policy is finding a good IRB to work with. Luckily, study teams have options when it comes to selecting a Single IRB. First, academic IRBs are IRBs associated with an institution such as the university. As I mentioned previously, one of your study team's first choices might be a local academic IRB at the lead investigator's institution. Explore this option early on to determine if your local IRB has the capacity and infrastructure to serve as a Single IRB of record for the study. Some may and some may not. If you can't work with your local IRB but prefer to use an academic IRB, there are some academic IRBs, such as the University of Utah and Washington University, that may agree to serve as a Single IRB even if the lead investigator of the study is not affiliated with their institution. Another viable option is selecting a Commercial IRB. Commercial IRBs are typically for-profit organizations that specialize in reviewing research protocols for large, multi-site trials. Of the many options available, the CTN is familiar with a few specific IRBs, including Western IRB, Quorum, Advara, and Brainy. One question that study teams often grapple with is how to decide whether to use an academic or commercial IRB. This can be a complicated choice since it is influenced by many study-level factors. While these might not ring true for all academic and commercial IRBs, we have found that the following pros and cons are generally true of each type of IRB. So in general, academic IRBs tend to have a lower cost and are also tended to be well trusted by other academic IRBs, making seating review a bit easier. However, academic IRBs might not have the full infrastructure to serve as a Single IRB, and as a result, your turnaround times may be slower, and their experience working as a Single IRB may be lower. Further, many academic IRBs do not agree to serve as a Single IRB unless the lead investigator is affiliated with their institution. Conversely, commercial IRBs generally have a very quick turnaround time, with several board meetings scheduled every week. They also often have a dedicated project manager available to answer questions from site staff and node staff. Further, commercial IRBs tend to have more experience working as a Single IRB for large multi-site projects. However, they do tend to be expensive and may not be very well trusted by local IRBs in order to speed review. One of the questions that comes up a lot is how do I evaluate a Single IRB for potential use on a study? As many of you have learned through experience, there are a lot of choices out there, but not all of them are good, and not all of them may meet the specific needs of your study. When looking into potential IRBs, it is important to develop a list of targeted questions to ask of the IRB during the vetting process. While some of these questions can be answered by simply looking at the IRB's website, others will need to be answered by an IRB representative directly. So IRBs and commercial IRBs in particular often have a business development or account specialist whose primary role is to answer questions for potential clients. Seek out this person and set up a meeting or two with them to discuss your study and ensure that the IRB can meet your needs. To streamline this process, I recommend writing up an official list of questions and sending it to the IRB representative ahead of time so that they're prepared to answer your questions during the scheduled meeting. So what type of questions should you ask? You'll first want to include general questions on things like the fee schedule, billing procedures, the overall submission process, the IRB's meeting schedule and turnaround time, and other such things. It's also very important to ask about accreditation, since IRBs are actually not required by law to be accredited in order to review and approve research protocols. The only accreditation that is legitimate at this time is the AAHRPP accreditation, which stands for Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. If the IRB cites an accreditation that you're not familiar with, make sure to look into it to see if it's actually legitimate. Lastly, if you're crunched for time in your study startup phase, you might consider asking the IRB how long it usually takes for their legal department to set up contracts with new clients. You also need to make sure that the IRB has the capacity to serve as a single IRB of record for your study. Ask them about their experience serving as a single IRB and the procedures they have in place for working with local IRBs who will seek review. Make sure the IRB has adequate resources to assist your study sites, particularly if they are spread out across time zones, and get details on how the IRB tends to communicate with the research site. Study teams should also pose questions related to the study population, phase of trial, trial design, any investigational product being studied, and any other unique or intricate aspects of the trial. It's important to work with an IRB that has experience with the nature and complexity of the research being proposed. For example, one key issue to consider within the CTN is the inclusion of prisoners in research, like I mentioned previously. While CTN trials typically do not enroll prisoners, it is often the case, given the study population, that research participants may become prisoners or otherwise meet the definition of a prisoner while they are enrolled in the trial. To protect these participants, the CTN encourages study teams to apply for OHARP prisoner certification. In order to obtain the certification, a prisoner representative must sit on the board during IRB review of the protocol. So in short, if you plan on obtaining OHARP prisoner certification for your study, you will need to ensure that the single IRB has the capacity to provide a prisoner representative for this purpose. Many local institutions and IRBs have requirements for working with an outside IRB as the IRB of record. For example, some local institutions may agree to cede, but still require a local context review, and sometimes even annual or more frequent review of protocol deviations, adverse events, and reportable new information. The local institution or IRB may require this type of review for a number of reasons. For example, to perform a scientific review or other ancillary review, to confirm if there is any conflict of interest among their local investigators, and to confirm adequate GCP and HSP training for study staff. The institution will also want to ensure that they have the capacity to perform the research being proposed. Lastly, there is often institutional responsibility placed on the IRB and the Human Research Protections Program for following regulations and protecting human research subjects. So reviewing protocols, even when agreeing to cede to an IRB, helps the local IRB adhere to this responsibility. It is extremely important to have these discussions with sites very early on, preferably during the site selection process, so that you can get a feel for what local requirements the site must meet and how long the review times typically are for their local IRB. In order for a local IRB to officially cede review to a single IRB, an IRB Authorization Agreement needs to be put in place. This is a formal document signed by both the relying IRB and the designated single IRB and is sometimes referred to as a reliance agreement. Some local IRBs or institutions may already have a master authorization agreement in place with a single IRB, either directly or through the Smart IRB platform. In these cases, a new authorization agreement is not required for each individual research project or protocol. All reliance agreements are considered essential regulatory documents and should be filed alongside the IRB approvals in the site's regulatory file. I've linked a template authorization agreement at the end of this presentation. A few budgetary items should be considered when working with a single IRB. The first is determining who will pay the IRB and with which funds the IRB will be paid. It is also very important to obtain the IRB fee schedule ahead of time and work closely with the IRB to create a detailed estimate of the projected IRB cost for the entire study. Factor in the cost of the initial study level and site level reviews, the estimated number of protocol and consent amendments that might be expected during the trial, the approximate number of participant-facing materials to be reviewed, the expected number of unanticipated problems, and other such things. So for example, if the projected enrollment period is 12 months with a 6-month follow-up after last enrollment, it's probably good to assume that at least 2 annual continuing reviews will be needed during the life of the trial. In general, good practice is to overestimate by at least 20% to ensure you have adequate funds to cover any unexpected IRB costs that are incurred during the trial. In addition to asking pointed questions when interviewing an IRB, make a note about the experience you've had trying to obtain this information from the IRB. So were they quick to respond to your meeting request, and did they have their answers prepared in advance? Were they candid about their capabilities, or did they seem to skirt around the difficult questions? Going with the gut feeling you have about an IRB may help you avoid future headaches when working with that IRB down the road. Another good suggestion is to reach out to your colleagues within the CTN and elsewhere to get a sense of their experience working with a certain IRB. You might ask whether the IRB was professional and if they were generally easy to work with. You could also inquire as to whether the IRB succeeded in meeting its deadlines and if they were reliable in producing documents that were free from major errors. Getting a sense of others' experience with a certain IRB can be very eye-opening and should be attempted if feasible during the IRB vetting process. So before we end today's presentation, I want to switch gears slightly and provide a brief overview of how submissions to the single IRB typically work. The process for submitting a protocol is similar across both commercial and academic IRBs that agree to serve as the single IRB for a given trial. First, the protocol, template, informed consent form, and other study-level documents are submitted for initial review and approval by the IRB. In the CTN, this is typically done by a regulatory specialist or project manager at the lead node. Most IRBs have online platforms for the submission and management of IRB applications. Once initial IRB approval is granted, study sites are required to submit site-level investigator applications, which provide site-specific details to the IRB, including any site-level consent forms if any of the language differs from the IRB-approved template. Each research site should designate a study staff member who is responsible for managing the IRB submissions throughout the life of the trial. As the trial progresses, sites are responsible for submitting things like protocol deviations, adverse events, reportable new information, and unanticipated problems to the IRB in accordance with the IRB's policies, which are typically laid out in an IRB handbook. The sites will also complete continuing reviews and other site-level modifications, such as personnel changes. The lead node will submit study-level changes during the life of the trial, including any protocol modifications and updates to the informed consent template. At the end of the trial, both site-level and study-level closeout submissions are typically required. In the CTN, the lead node regulatory specialist is responsible for working with the sites to ensure compliance with the single IRB policies and procedures and ensuring that IRB approval is maintained throughout the life of the trial. To close out today's presentation, I'd like to remind everyone about the Investigator's Toolbox. The Investigator's Toolbox is located on the CTN website and is a wonderful resource for both lead study teams and site staff. And as I mentioned earlier in today's talk, the Toolbox contains additional resources on how to develop and submit the Single IRB plan to the GSMB. Finally, here is a list of some additional resources that may be helpful when working with a Single IRB. You will be able to access these links when the slides are posted to the CTN Dissemination Library.